thanking all the members or the witnesses for their testimony. We will now turn to questions for the panel, and the chair recognizes himself for the first round of questions. I'm going to start with you, Ms. Lauder. I read through a bunch of what you submitted. I'll admit I didn't read through every single bit of it. It's voluminous, emails and correspondence. And as the county manager, I'm not sure, maybe you never thought about the mission of FEMA, but it's to coordinate between the federal agencies and, of course, state and local agencies. But it was never designed to be the command and control and do all the work, right? But that's kind of what's expected of it now. And it seems to me, as the person that's trying to figure that out, you know, in the aftermath of this devastating disaster, like, you don't have time to figure that out. You're just trying to deliver, right? I remember the 2 times we were flooded out of our home. One time we stayed in the fire hall before we moved to a neighbor's house that wasn't affected. Somebody we didn't even know just offered to come take us in. And then the other time was at the township building. And I'm thinking about it, but it seems to me as I read through your correspondence here, much of your county didn't even exist, right? There wasn't any, there might not have been a township building, a fire hall, or a neighbor's house to go to. And so I'm just wondering, from your experience, I mean, you couldn't get answers even about a federally owned property for which to place temporary housing on. You couldn't get any answers on that, let alone the housing. If you were going to give everybody here, which I think are very interested in trying to figure out how to make this work, what would be the one message, you know, as a person who has lived through it and experienced it and been frustrated by it and seen people like you described, living in trailers filled with mold and having no prospect whatsoever of anything changing anytime soon? What would be the one message regarding what FEMA, how it would be different in your eyes if it were going to work?
At local government, we were looking for resources. We needed assistance, and what we could not find were how to leverage those resources. The resources that we were offered, like TSA, were very clearly not suited for my community. And so I think the message that I would have is that, number one, communication. If there's resources being offered, we need to understand what those terms are up front so that we can even evaluate whether or not they're going to be effective in a community. The second is there has to be some responsiveness. Whenever we identified issues, whenever we identified resources like the federal property, we had to follow up on that ourselves. We were living a disaster in our own lives. We were living a disaster with our community, and yet we were having to follow up repeatedly in order to try to get any progress or any answers, or even find out if our requests were being heard anywhere. I submitted that property no less than 4 times in 4 different ways, and still, when I got on a call in November to ask about housing, they pulled up a database, and none of those requests managed to get into the database. So I think the 2 messages are that the communication structures have to be robust. They need to happen before the disaster so that we know who even to call. And we also need to know upfront how to use these resources or make those resources more flexible so that whenever we identify what the needs are and how that's going to play out in our community, we can use them.
Do you have any indication at this point why it took so long for FEMA to even show up? Right, you're like, right after this happened, obviously everybody knows what's happened, but it took days and days. And then I think it's my understanding when they finally did show up, they were headquarters like 90 miles away, which is a fair drive, right? Especially in bad condition. Do you have any indication now what took them so long?
I have never been given a reason. I can hypothesize. I think the fact that we are on the edge of the disaster was part of it. It's hard to get through the mountains. You don't get places very easily. The only other thing I can imagine is that our numbers, like for a TSA, did not look like they were high, which could indicate on a data front point that we didn't need help, but they weren't high because it wasn't an applicable solution for Transylvania County.
Okay, I got a lot of questions and a little bit of time here for each one of you. Mr. Guthrie, you perfected, I think, or at least honed a fraud prevention program in your state. Can you briefly outline how that might be applicable to FEMA? Because there is a huge amount of fraud in the FEMA dollars that are spent, and we'd obviously like that not to be the case.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Perry, for that question. In Florida, we knew that there was the propensity to have fraud, waste, and abuse. And what we did, starting about 2 years ago, is we built a program that we want to get good structured data into our system. That helps us get good structured data, and it allows us to utilize large language modeling, machine learning, and to a certain point, some generative AI to predict when we may have a duplicate payment, or the payment doesn't actually check the box for the contract. In other words, a vendor has charged us more than what they should have. So again, it focuses from a standpoint of getting the good structured data into the system, and then we use machine learning on the backside to do that. And we're detecting, just in the recent months, we had 3 situations for about $600,000 that we flagged for potential fraud, waste, or abuse, and then we put eyes on that to then investigate it and correct the anomalies that were in the invoices. And it was just that. It was an anomaly in the invoices where we were charged a different rate when we should have been charged a lower rate, but it did end up saving taxpayer dollars just in the last 3 months, $600,000.
I appreciate the response.